California Community Choice Association. If you've taken a look at the email from Monday with the agenda, you can see that we have a pretty packed agenda with 5 presentations. So we are going to do our best to try to stick to the allotted times. We did hear just this morning that the folks from SCE who are presenting second will not be able to join us in the afternoon. So we may use some time after noon to allocate some additional Q&A so that SE staff are there to answer questions before they have to sign off. We'll see how that goes. Just a few reminders.
Yes, so we're in a bit of a box here, and I don't know that we can figure all out this call because I don't have much time, but I'd like to.
Stephen, can you please mute yourself? Thanks. All right, so I just wanted to go over a few deadlines, some due dates between now and the next workshop, which is on the 17th. The next workshop will be on need determination and allocation. So if you're interested in presenting at that workshop, please let the co-facilitators know by this Friday. And the contact information for the co-facilitators was in the email sent to the distribution list on Monday. But just as a reminder, that's Alan Meck from SDG&E and Jen No and Sergio Duenas from CISA. As I said, their email addresses are in the email from Monday. Maybe if they are on the line, they could type their email addresses into the chat. And then next up, we have the informal comments that are going to be due on the 10th that cover all of the workshops up to that point. So that's all of the workshops on the structural elements and the resource counting. Just keep in mind that those are informal comments, so you only need to send those to the service list. You do not need to e-file those. And then a final reminder that the presentation is being recorded. There should also be a notice on your screen about that. But just as a reminder, we'll also let you know again after lunch. So first up, we have PG&E presenting another follow-up presentation on resource counting. So I will turn the microphone over to Luke and Peter.
Got to get myself off of mute. Good morning, everyone. This is Peter Griffiths. I'm with PG&E, and I am accompanied by Luke Nickerman. We will be talking for the most part about sort of where we are and what we're proposing for resource counting, or at least options for resource counting. So Luke, why don't we go ahead to the next slide. At PG&E, we like to start with a safety message. The safety messages for the most part are relatively the same, or at least, we talk about things. We live in earthquake country. I think everyone is aware of duct covering and hold. Certainly, we need to be aware of other potential threats. We are all working remotely, so those are probably somewhat unique to sort of the location where we're working in terms of fire and ergonomics. The one thing I wanted to highlight is eye health. Yesterday, I went to the optometrist and the ophthalmologist to get my eyes checked. I am still doing pretty well, but one reminder is that we are now spending a lot of time in front of screens in terms of looking at and working remotely. And for our good eye health, there's the 20-20-20 rule. And what that is it's a recommendation that every 20 minutes that we look away at something from our screens, essentially to something 20 feet away for 20 seconds. So every 20 minutes, look away at something that's 20 feet away and look at it for 20 seconds. That to some degree will provide some benefit, or at least some eye relief to the strain of that. And I think it's something we probably all need to be doing, given the fact that we're communicating in the way that we are, and we are all looking at screens that I know mine is probably about 2 feet from my eyes. So it's good to look away. With that, let me go ahead and jump into the next slide, please, Luke. the desired outcomes for this workshop. Before I get into the desired outcomes, I would like to talk a little bit about sort of where we are in the process from PG&E's perspective. We have talked about sort of what the slice of day structure was going to be in the first couple of workshops. The last workshop, we introduced the question of sort of resource counting, and we're going to talk more about that, a lot more about that. The next two workshops are really set up to talk about need determination and how those needs should be set up. What this is working towards to some degree is an entire package. And what we will probably be doing in the next workshop from PG&E's perspective is trying to pull everything together and all of the pieces together into a coherent proposal or set of proposals that we can then talk about on a more concrete basis. The feedback we've been getting, I mean, what we've been really trying to do is to try and make sure that parties understand how all the pieces fit together, or at least what all the pieces are and how they will fit together. And in the next workshop, we will be providing a much stronger sort of statement as to how they should be fitting together and what a particular proposal is. For this workshop, however, I want to focus on sort of what our outcomes are. And first of all, number one is to clarify the role of the slice a day framework in the planning and the operations thinking. RA sits sort of between very much the operations aspect as well as the planning aspects. We're not planning so far in advance that we're producing new resources or changing the resource mix by very much. But we are, for the most part, and we are basically setting things up so that operationally the system can meet the demand going forward. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, have a slide on that. We also want to introduce resource counting proposals for specific resource types. There are a lot of different resource types, and we've talked to some degree in general about exceedance. We want to talk very much more specifically about each resource type and sort of where things are and how the counting is done and how that could change. And finally, we want to talk a little bit about we've talked about exceedance and how exceedance can be used. We want to talk about sort of how you determine, or at least a little bit of how you should be determining what exceedance levels should be used for wind and solar. And so we've got a little bit of analysis on that, and we'll be covering that as well. So why don't you go to the next slide, please, Luke? Before I get too far into it, I want to make sure that we also get grounded, or at least remind ourselves of what the Commission adopted principles are. These are the principles that were laid out in the decision that we need to be thinking about in the working group and balancing. There are a number of different areas. If you look at each one of these, it's really very much balancing various aspects of things, balancing reliability with cost, making sure we have sufficiency on an hourly basis, and making sure that we're taking care of the climate as well, and having the right level of granularity. I mean, all of these things are balanced. I want to make sure that what we're looking at and trying to think about is how to set this up so that we get the right balance on all of this. And of course, we've got the implementation in the relatively near term, which it could easily is something we want to keep in mind as well. So why don't we move forward to the next slide? What we would like to sort of get out of this presentation in terms of what PG&E's objectives are is to basically provide a reasonable measure of sort of what a resource can contribute to meeting load at particular times of the day or at particular times of need during the day. And one of the problems that the system has had, or what the RA system has had, is that we haven't had a good matching between sort of what resource can produce at particular times of the day versus what the resource need is on the system at those times. And I think certainly the August 2020 experience showed us that that was something that we need to really address. So we want to make sure that the resource counting that we're putting together does have very much the capability of reflecting what resources can produce at various times of the day. We also want to simplify resource counting rules. We want to make sure that they're relatively straightforward and that they are and that it's well understood and relatively easy to calculate. And then we want to sort of use those counting rules, or how the counting rules essentially could work to sort of fit into the slice of day and inform sort of what the design should be of the slice of day. So these are the main objectives that we have that we want to cover today. So let's get to it. So planning versus operations. We want to be very explicit here about sort of the role of resource adequacy and what we're doing and how we're thinking about this. The RA program is very much intended to be a planning effort. It's not a full long-range planning effort, but it is a planning effort to plan to some degree how the resources that are in existence essentially are planned to be used and to be able to meet load in the market and on an operational basis. And to make sure that there is enough of those resources available at the right times to be able to do that. So there are three different categories to consider. One is the QC value, or what can the resource count for in terms of how much can it produce. That is within scope of this. That is sort of very much how are we thinking about planning for meeting that operational need. The resource filing, that also is part of this in planning aspect, and that is very much how does the resources, are the resources shown by the LSCs that they're under contract to be available to meet the requirements that they have. The market dispatch of the resource in terms of what the must offer obligation is and how exactly that resource has to participate in the market. That's much more of an operational question. And so it's less of a planning question, and therefore, to some degree, not something that we think needs to be part of what we're describing or how we're setting it up. So that's really much more operations. And I want to make sure that sort of we're not trying to think about, if we're only going to have a certain resources be available for certain times of day, or at least that for them to count on them essentially for producing in those times of day, that those are the only times a day that they need to be able to show up and participate in the market. That's an operational question, and we're not really dealing with operational questions in this proceeding. That is much more. That's much more a topic for the scope for the ISO and how the RA program its RA program essentially fits into the operations of the market. So with that clarity, let me essentially go forward and talk a little more about sort of what the resource counting is in each resource. So here's a table of, if you look at it, basically what we've tried to do is to give an idea of what is a resource type, what is the current approach for counting for resource adequacy, in terms of how is it counted for now under the current RA paradigm, and then sort of how much capacity, and this is NQC capacity, this is not nameplate capacity. And there is, to a large degree, and I think everybody knows there's a difference between the two. But we have what we're summarizing here for the most part are the resource types and how they're currently counted. And what we're going to be doing in the rest of the presentation is very much trying to take these resource types and talk about how they might well be measured under a slice of day type of proposal. Currently we have dispatchable resources, which are at a Pmax. The Pmax, that's the maximum output a plant can have, as defined by the ISO in terms of the way that is established. I believe the test is a 4-hour test in terms of what the maximum output is, sustained output for 4 hours of the resource, and it is tested on that basis. For storage, storage is also sort of a Pmax, and it's also measured over a 4-hour period, was the maximum output over for 4 hours. Wind and solar currently are using an ELCC, or effective load carrying capability type of measure. And we see sort of what the current NQCs are there. Those, again, are not the nameplates. Those are what the NQCs are in terms of how they line up. The ELCC methodology is a particularly good methodology for planning, particularly planning in the long term. It's certainly not clear to PG&E that it makes sense to be using ELCC in the relatively short term when we're talking about resource adequacy and what that means. Currently, the ELCC values are calculated on a monthly basis, and there's some question and the way that's done and the way that's implemented is probably not very reflective of what the resources can provide to the system at any particular time of the month. So those are that's one of the areas where we'll be spending a lot of time and a lot of discussion is on wind and solar, and essentially how an exceedance type of methodology could work in those areas. Co-located and hybrid, it really is a combination to some degree of what the underlying energy supply resource can do, and what the storage can do. So it's a combination of those two things. For the non-dispatchable capacity, it's very much average generation. It's looking historically what has been able to be done over time, and try and base on that sort of what the expectation is for going forward for that same sort of time period. Storage-based hydro, it's been sort of monthly exceedance values over the past 10 years. That was relatively newly adopted by the Commission a couple of years ago, and that's the way it is currently done. Imports are contracted amounts. Demand response, it's really very much based on the load impact protocols in the DR proceeding. So those are the ways that the resources are currently being counted. We, for the most part, are going to try and go through each type of these resource and talk about sort of how we think they should be measured, or how they should be measured for counting for RA under a slice of day paradigm. So next slide, please, Luke. Dispatchable resources. Our proposal here is basically to rely mostly on what we currently have in terms of a PMAX, but acknowledge the fact that there are times of year and times of day when some conventional resources are not able to be produced at their full output, largely because of ambient weather and temperature conditions, and that there needs to be, to some degree, a limitation on sort of how much they can provide in a particular hour or a particular slice of day, because of the fact that the ambient temperature may be limiting the amount of output at that resource. So our accounting and the way we're thinking about it is basically to look at the Pmax and essentially adjust for ambient temperature. And so the parameters that we would be using or looking at would be looking at sort of, okay, how have the ambient D rates impact, for the most part, the resource counting or the availability of the resource to produce on a historic basis, and to calculate that in a season slice type of framework. And what we would do is we would be looking back sort of at a 3-year period and looking at sort of weighting each of those 3 years equally in terms of how that would be set up. And then that would calculate to some degree what the ambient D rate would be, and then we would adjust the Pmax for that in the dispatchable resource. At least that's a proposal, that's PG&E's proposal for having to deal with dispatchable resources. So let's move to the next one. Next slide, please, Luke. For standalone energy storage, for the most part is measured by sort of the full output of the resource. The full output is determined during the slice, subject to sort of interconnection limits. An example, because generally what we currently say is a 4-hour resource, and we talk about 4-hour batteries. But a 4-hour battery, for the most part, is really very much sort of what the maximum output could be for that resource for 4 hours. Under the slice of day proposal, there would be some flexibility for the resource essentially to determine how much it would want to be counting for resource for RA, depending upon and pre-committing to how they would operate or when they would be available to operate in the market. So, and as an example, if we had a 100 megawatt storage resource, which is basically has 400 megawatt hours of storage in terms of energy storage, it could count for 100 megawatts across a 4-hour slice, if its slices are 4 hours, or it could count for 100 megawatts for 4 hours if we have hourly slices, or if we're looking at sort of a 24 slice framework. Alternatively, it could count for less based on sort of what its energy availability is. So that if it wanted to operate at a much lower availability, it say could operate at 40 megawatts for say 10 hours. And the idea here is that we want to make sure that we are lining up essentially the resource's capability of being able to produce energy and giving it some flexibility and understanding that there is flexibility there. Also, there is a limit, though, that it wouldn't be able to count for 100 megawatts in a single hour, because that essentially is an interconnection limit or a limit on the capacity of the battery. So there would be an upper limit on the capacity of the resource, but it could count for any number of slices or any number of ways, depending upon how it's committing to operate. The full output, or sort of this full energy availability, we think it is relatively reasonable and accurately essentially reflects what the resource could do. Certainly, if the resource wanted to be able to produce more than that, and so we're say if battery wanted to cycle more than once in a 24-hour period, and was willing to make that commitment to be available to do so, then essentially they could do that. We wouldn't necessarily restrict that. However, there would be the restriction that the LSC that would be showing that resource would need to be showing sufficient capacity in slices to be able to provide the energy to charge that resource. And the question to some degree is as well, how would that necessarily be done, and how would that be set up? Generally, you could be having a resource count. It would be possible to essentially to have a resource count in a particular slice, and also have a resource, the LSE, to bring capacity to charge that resource. Although to some degree that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because the capacity that is needed to charge the resource would have to be larger than what the battery resource could provide. So these are the limits to some degree, are at least on the way that we're thinking about essentially the standalone storage should be able to count, and how it could count for in the slice of day framework. Next slide, please. Wind and solar. At this point, I'm going to hand it off to Luke to talk about wind and solar. We do have a proposal in terms of exceedance, and we have particular ways that might work. So Luke, can you take it away?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Okay, so we mentioned several times before that we're proposing to move to an exceedance-based methodology for solar and wind, but we haven't detailed kind of the parameters that would be around that, or how you would determine what the right exceedance level is. And so we're going to walk through some of that today. So we're going to start off with the parameters, which we have on this slide. And so we're proposing using 5 years of data as a basis for determining the exceedance levels, and weighting all those years equally. Now, 5 years is more than the 3 years that we had in the dispatchable. Why is that? And the reason is, when we started to look at the data, at least for solar, we were seeing impacts from wildfires, or at least what we thought were impacts from wildfires. And so it seemed to us that we might want to use a little bit more than the 3 years of data that we proposed for the dispatchable resources. But this is something that we're open to discussing with stakeholders as well. So for existing resources that have the 5 years of data, we could apply that at the resource level or at some aggregated level. So there's been discussion about what the right aggregated level is if we were to do that. And so that might be like a geographic location for wind, or a technology type for solar, like tracking and non-tracking. And so we're not taking a position on what the right level is, other than to say that we think we should get a little bit more granularity than we have today, right? So some kind of geographic level with wind, and at least technology types with solar. For new resources that don't have 5 years of data, for those, they would be assigned a value based on an average of resources with a similar type, whether that's kind of the technology type or geography. And then also, I think this came up in the last workshop about whether the exceedance level would vary by hour. Our position is that we shouldn't be doing that. We should keep them constant across all hours. And so, for instance, we shouldn't have some hours that have a 50% exceedance level and others that have 75% exceedance level. It just adds a lot of additional complexity and adds a lot of additional questions about how you would kind of administer and update the program. Like how often would you, update those levels, and are they changing every year? And then what are the impacts that those changes could have across transactions and other issues as well. So let's go to the next slide here. So how to determine the exceedance level. So this is something that we've been wrestling with for a while, and we've come up with an approach that we think has some merit, and I want to kind of introduce that to the stakeholders. We're calling it the peak load day approach, and essentially what you're doing is you're identifying the peak load day in each month during the historical year in question. So, if you're looking at 5 years of data, you would be looking at what's the peak load in August 2020, what's the peak load day in August 2019, 2018, etc. And then you would kind of average that load day across that period, and that would give you kind of a production profile for a 24-hour period for solar and wind. And so in each hour in each month, you would have kind of an expected production, peak day production for those resources. Then you would also build some exceedance profiles. So you would, we have a couple of examples here, 50%, 60%, 75%. You could look at others as well. But essentially you would build those, which also give you a production profile. And then you would compare the peak load day performance to the exceedance production at each of the levels, and then select the one that's the best match. So let's get into some examples of how that might work. So here are some examples for solar. And let me just kind of walk through how these tables are set up. So you are taking the difference in each of these. You're taking the difference between the exceedance production at each of the levels, and you can see the first table is the 50% exceedance level. The second one is 75% level. The third one is 60% level. And then the peak load day production for the 5-year period that we're looking at, so 2015 to 2020. And so if you get a positive number, and you can see in the 50% table, the first one, there's a lot of positive numbers, which are in red. That's indicating that that you are counting on more solar showing up than typically shows up in the average worst day. If you're getting a negative number, and the negative numbers are in green, you are counting on less solar than typically shows up in the average worst day. So ideally, you would find, a profile where everything is 0, but that just isn't going to happen. And so what we tried to do is we looked at starting with 50%, how good of a fit is that? And what you see is that in a lot of the summer months, so June, July, August, September to a certain extent as well, you kind of have these relatively large positive values in the evening hours, hour ending 17, 18, 19, which would be concerning, right? Because you're essentially counting on more solar showing up in those hours than typically shows up on the worst day. So then we said, okay, well, let's do something that's more conservative. So that's why you see the 75% exceedance level here. And what you can see here is that all of the values are green. So this means that we are counting less than typically shows up, and that's not good either, right? We don't want to undercount solar and wind, and so then we tried another one, which is the 60% level at the bottom table, and we got a result that seems like it's maybe a good balance. And so you can see, in some of the months you have some green values and negative values, and some of the months you have some red values. But in kind of the key summer months, June, July, August, September, kind of the later hours, the values are relatively small, right? There would be kind of manageable values, and the values go both ways. So it's some are positive, some are negative. And so, and kind of looking at this data set at the aggregate level, at the solar level, it seemed like 60% might be a reasonable balance. So we did the same exercise for wind. And so you can see, starting off with a 50% exceedance level, you're reading this the same way. So a positive value means that you are counting more wind than typically shows up on the worst day. And those values are in red. And then the green values mean that you're counting less than typically shows up on the worst day. And so at the 50% exceedance level, we're seeing a lot of red, and in particular in the summer months in the evenings. And so we went to something more conservative, the 75% exceedance level. And we got a lot more green, and the feeling was, well, maybe this is more green than we need, and so we backed it off a little bit. We don't have it in the slide here, but we tried a 60% exceedance level as well, and it looked somewhat similar to the 50% level, and so then that's why we went up to the 70% level, which is what you see in the bottom table, and it seemed like that might strike a reasonable balance. And you can see in the summer months in the evening hours, the values are pretty close to zero, and some are positive and some are negative. And so, our kind of conclusion from looking at this data is that maybe, for wind, maybe 70% exceedance levels, it strikes an appropriate balance. Okay, so we're going to shift to a few other resources, and then I'm going to hand it back to Peter. So we're going to talk about hybrid and co-located. Our feeling with hybrid and co-located is that we think the existing framework could be largely utilized with one modification. And so the existing framework, the way it is set up is that if you have sufficient solar and wind resources to charge the battery in a particular month, then you get the full QC value for the battery in that month. And the approach that Peter outlined was what we're calling full output, and so that's why we have full output there in parentheses. The main change, though, is that under the existing methodology, any remaining solar or wind energy is then converted back to a capacity value, and an ELCC value is applied to that remainder. And so the change that we would be proposing here is that instead of applying an ELCC value, that we would apply an exceedance value. And then one other difference is that we don't think there will be a standard charging profile across all hybrid and co-located resources, and so the exceedance value that's applied likely should be a resource specific value and not some kind of aggregated value. Okay, so looking at storage-based hydro, so this is a resource that we didn't include in our presentation last time. There was some questions about it, and so we've included it here to clarify those. We're largely proposing that methodology stay intact, the methodology that's currently used. It's an exceedance-based approach. It uses 10 years of hydro bid data, calculates a 50% exceedance and a 90% exceedance and weights them at 80% and 20% respectively. And the 90% exceedance that's included to provide a greater weight to the poor hydro years. And so we're largely suggesting that methodology stay intact. The one difference is that you do need to apply it to a slice or kind of hourly framework. Right now, it's applied on a peak value basis, but it would be fairly easily to adapt that to providing values over slices or every hour. If a 24 slice type framework is adopted. Non-dispatchable resources. So this is a relatively small kind of aggregate QC bucket, but it includes a number of different resource types. We're not proposing methodology changes here, just that you would essentially apply the current methodology to each of the slices or to the hourly values in a 24 slice type framework. And then imports. So a couple things here. If an import is non-resource specific, then we don't think there needs to be changes to the existing methodology, which is based on the contracted amount. If it is resource specific, so for instance, if it's a wind or solar resource, then it could be updated to the counting rules that we're proposing here. So for example, exceedance for wind or solar. And then the one other thing that we want to note with imports is that there's standard products, and those standard products, at least at first, might not align perfectly with the slices. If we do end up with a framework that has slices that are greater than an hour. And so that's something that should be considered in the final framework. And so the three products that we have listed here, there's all hours, there's high load hours, hour ending 7 to 22, or low load hours, which is hour ending 1 to 6 and 23 to 24. And so if we end up with a framework that doesn't align with these, then we could end up with imports that don't count in certain slices. Okay, and we're gonna turn it back to Peter for demand response. Peter, I think you're on mute.
Thank you, Luke. There are a couple of aspects of demand response that we wanted to highlight here. One is sort of how the resource is shown, particularly sort of what the design is of the resource and how it is designed to be to actually participate in the market and produce output. And so there are two aspects of it. One is sort of how is it shown, and the other is sort of how is the value that it can count for, is where is that being determined and how it is determined. The showing approach, for the most part, in the slice of date framework is really very much aligned with sort of the size of the slice and the nature of what the design program is for the DR resource. For instance, if it's a 5-hour DR resource and we're talking about a 4-hour slice, then essentially a program that that is a 5-hour program could only essentially count for one slice in that, and would not essentially be available to provide output in multiple slices under that type of an example. So there's a question to some degree on sort of what the resource availability is and how the resource availability would be able to count. That does need to line up essentially with the slices and sort of how we're thinking about the size of the slices. The other aspect about demand response is the value in terms of what it can count for. Now, we're in the middle of the RA proceeding, and this is a discussion in the RA proceeding. However, there are other efforts at the commission that is looking at sort of what the correct way of looking at and calculating the value for DR is. The DR proceeding has a load impact protocols, or a LIP. There's also been discussion about using an ELCC type of methodology. At this point, we are not essentially proposing one way or another of counting, but leaving it essentially to that essentially proceeding to be able to weigh in on essentially the right way to be able to count for what DR can, the levels that DR can count for. We are planning to try and coordinate with CEC staff and sort of thinking about sort of how that methodology that's being discussed there could fit into a slice of day framework. But at this stage, it is preliminary, or a little too preliminary to have had any particular proposals at this point. Next slide, please. Multi-day reliability. This is a topic that came up. It's sort of the slice of day is very much looking at a typical day for a period, a season, or a month or a season, and on the assumption that that typical day could represent any typical day or a typical day within that month or season. Questions have been raised about sort of resource availability that may not be available for, say, a particular month or the entirety of a particular month or particular season. And two resource types that fit into this. One is sort of our sort of demand response and hydro. We think that with regard to hydro, we think that the exceedance approach would be able to address this and capture sort of what the diminishing impact of that water is in terms of what its availability is. And so we think that to some degree that could be captured in the metric that we're talking about. Demand response, there needs to be essentially more coordination with that. If a demand response program is only available for a certain number of days a month or instances in a season, that needs to probably also to be taken into account, and we need to think about how to coordinate that going forward. With that, I think that gets us to the end of our prepared slides. I will note that there seems to be a number of people who have their hands raised for questions. As you can tell, we decided not to stop and answer clarifying questions in the midst because we wanted to make sure we get through it. As Scott indicated early in the introduction, we are going to be called off at our allotted time frame, which I think is at 11:05. So we have about 20 minutes for questions. So Carrie, do you have a question?
I do. Thanks, Peter. Can you go to slide 9? So I'll hold off on all comments then, since we are tight on time, and just ask the clarifying question. Your bullet that says LSCs need to show sufficient capacity to charge storage. Can you elaborate on what you mean by capacity? For example, the energy value of solar far exceeds the capacity value. So this was a little confusing to me. And then whether you meant renewable specifically capacity, or whether, a natural gas plant, in the morning will have sufficient excess capacity, and whether that would serve to be able to charge storage.
Yeah, Carrie, we're not making a distinction as to what we're trying to do with this restriction on standalone storage is make sure that there's enough energy in the system, and so the capacity, or at least the resource that we'll be charging, needs to be in excess of meeting an RA need. So in your example, essentially, if there is a solar resource that is producing more than what the load is in a particular hour for a particular LSC, that LSC can use that and point to that and say, here is essentially the energy or the capacity that will essentially be providing that charging. That capacity does not have to be solar. It can be anything. It can be gas-fired generation. It can be. It's just we're trying to make sure that there is enough energy in the system to charge the storage devices. Is that helpful?
It is. You know, I think my issue with this, then it seems like an unnecessary constraint, because if you are valuing thermal by slice, you're always going to have sufficient thermal available above load to charge storage and aggregate. I mean, you showed your NQC numbers before, and we know basic load shapes. So it seems to me if you're not going to limit it to renewables, then this will always be a non-binding constraint, at least for the foreseeable future.
Carrie, that may be the case, and I guess the concern that we have is that if we look far enough into the future, when we have gotten rid of a number of the gas-fired capacity, the gas capacity, it may well be a constraint that will kick in the future. I agree that it's not something that's likely to be binding in the short run. Yeah,
and just one follow-up on that. If it is a binding constraint, then by the time we're in the RA space, it's too late to address that constraint. We've already let the thermal go. Then we've had to, in IRP, build something else. So that's my concern by putting this in RA, not by IRP. But I'll stop there. Thanks, Peter.
Okay. Let's see. It looks like I'm not sure who is next. I guess next on my list is Dariush.
Yeah, Peter, let me just step in for a second. Hang on,
sure,
just
Scott.
To remind people to lower their hands when they're done with their questions. And I just point out we also have a couple of questions that have been raised in the chat. So I would suggest that Luke or Peter, whoever is not speaking at the moment, answering one of the hand raised questions could maybe address the questions that are in the chat.
Okay, we'll try and get to those, Scott.
Okay, should I move forward?
Yes.
Okay, so could we go to the slide? I didn't see the slide number where you showed all the exceedance numbers, exceedance calculation process that you went through, or reasoning process that you went through. This one, yeah. What I've seen in all these discussions around exceedance is to find a reasonable number to sort of attribute as RA capacity to wind and solar resources. And regardless of, and I guess the bottom line in all these discussions, arguments seems to be the correlation between wind and solar generation and an actual load value. In other words, to make some guesstimate of what's a good exceedance number that based on whether the wind or solar is correlated with actual load. And eventually we resort to all these kinds of rather, let's call it arbitrary arguments about them. If, however, wind and solar on instantaneous megawatt production, historical production, and actual load on instantaneous historical production are netted against each other, we take all this arbitrariness out of the picture. If we do all the assessment, whether it's in slice of day approach, based on net load, in addition to all other kinds of benefit that we could discuss, and focus on one number, which is the net load, historical net load, and whatever level we want to use for RA evaluation and so on. If we do that and focus on less variable energy resources like gas or hydro or things that are a lot more predictable than wind and solar. So if we take this argument to net load and do all this analysis based on historical net load, well, we subtract instantaneous values of wind and solar from instantaneous value of load, then we take all this arbitrariness out of the equation. Wind and solar are not in RA business anymore. They're just in netting load. And it's based on actual impact that they have had on historical level on load. wouldn't that take care of all this exceedance trials and tribulations and efforts to give it some meaning, some reasonable number?
I mean, Darius, I think what we need to do though is you have to realize that the RA program is based on forecasts, and so we need a forecast of net load. And is that forecast of net load going to be based on what? On the historic output of the wind and the solar, or is it going to be based on and at what level? For the most part, the problem is that both of those things are stochastic. Load and the outputs of these resources are stochastic, and what we're trying to do is to come up with a deterministic level for setting the requirement, or allowing for the resources account to be able to meet the load. So I think you still need to be thinking about and talking about how are you calculating what that net load is on a forecast basis.
And if we establish this net load value over a period of time, we eventually could be forecasting net load directly, as opposed to trying to forecast gross load, forecast solar, forecast wind, but at least establish the capabilities of wind and solar in terms of net load. And then going forward, either we can forecast net load going forward. I know we don't have much experience doing that, but there's no reason why the methods we have been using up to now for gross load, wind and solar could not be applied to net load, number one. Number two, since we are talking about future, we can take, when it comes to calculating net load for future, we can do the gross load and the wind and solar and try to work something out there. But if we take wind and solar out of the equation, focus on net load, and leave the RA provision to resources that we know can behave in a more predictable fashion, then we achieve a lot of benefits in that fashion and get out of this exceedance discussion as well.
Darius, I don't think you get out of the exceedance discussion, because you basically have to predict sort of at what level are you comfortable with the output for the wind and the solar on a forecast basis.
What if you do forecast net load based on instantaneous historical values? Why would we have to do that?
Well, because the number of resources the number of solar resources and wind resources are changing. It's not based on necessarily on the future isn't going to be based on what existed. It's going to be based on what will exist and what has existed. So,
but those could be worked out.
Yeah. Okay, Darius. Sorry, this is Scott. I think we need to move on to the next question.
Sure.
Thank you.
So, Alan, go ahead.
Hi, Alan Meck, SDG&E. I have a question about how, if we're just assigning one exceedance value to each resource, would that be workable, and could we still sort of marry that up with SCE's point from a couple weeks ago about how we should probably think about doing 24 slices, in other words, one slice every hour, in order to avoid undercounting our resources. If we only have one exceedance value across the entire day, does that work?
No, I'm going to say, Alan, the point is that you would only have an exceedance percentage that you would calculate then on an hourly basis. So it would be, say, a 70% exceedance, looking at all of the outputs, say, in a particular hour. That essentially would give you a 70% exceedance in that hour, and that's the value that you would use.
Oh, okay. I had misunderstood. Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. Tom.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Tom Beach for SIA LSA and Vote Solar. I had a technical question on your data set for that you used for these exceedance analysis. It says 2015 to 2020. Over that period, especially for solar, there was the fleet was growing,
Right.
and in order to do this, I think you would need to do an exceedance approach that covers this lengthy period of years. You must have had to normalize the amount of solar for the growth in the fleet over this time. Did you do that, and if so, how?
Good question, Tom. I'm gonna give that to Luke since he did the analysis.
Yeah, hey Tom. So we normalized it by doing the exceedance level as well as the worst day. So if you're doing the exceedance level for each year and kind of looking at the worst day for each year, it should automatically normalize it. But you are kind of raising an issue that after this meeting, I'm going to go back and check the data and make sure that that we were doing that on a yearly basis and not an average across all of the years.
And would you guys be willing to make your data available?
Yeah, so this is CAISO Oasis data, so it's a really large data set. But maybe what we could do is make available the like the formulas we used, and so that yeah, go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, no, Tom, I think we can make it available. We should probably take it offline though.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay. Chris Devon?
Yeah, hey Peter, it's Chris Devon from Customized Energy Solutions. I just wanted to comment and say, it feels like PG&E and some others keep arguing that exceedance is the right approach for this, and it's kind of dismissing the fact that the ELCC studies we were doing in IRP just continue to show declining values for the wind and solar resources into the future. And I'm worried that we're focusing too much on, how are we undervaluing the wind and solar contributions in these different slices of the day because of this need to address the slices and the reliability across the day in different hours or different periods across the day. So I actually tend to agree with Dariush, and his approach. And I don't think you have to actually come up with an exceedance methodology. So I just wanted to mention that on that, discussion we were having earlier, that I think you could just do a forecast of how much wind and solar production is going to come on the system. Obviously, we do that today for the LOLE studies, so we know what is going to come on in the future.
At what level though? Is that at what level of uncertainty do you have in that?
Well, I mean, I think you could debate that a little bit, but I'm just saying that you could forecast the amounts of the production the same way that you would forecast the load. You're doing a 1 and 2 load forecast. Maybe you can do 1 and 2 solar production forecast. I just think that by focusing on the resource counting rules right now, we should be focusing more on maybe perhaps setting those slices of the day and using a loss of load probability analysis to set those slices up. And obviously, if we use ELCC for a different slice in during the solar production hours, if there's no loss of load probability, you're going to get 0 ELCC value. I think that that has been explained pretty well by some others, like Paul Nelson to explain that in the previous meetings. But so I understand that there's a concern about that, but I just want to throw in here and inject that I do agree with Dariush that maybe it seems to make more sense that maybe we take the RA part out of the equation for wind and solar, net those resources off, and then figure out what other type of resources do you really need to maintain reliability across the rest of the day when we know that there's that pretty predictable wind and solar output that we're going to have, it just appears to me that we're kind of focusing a lot on the resource counting rules before we even have any idea what the actual slices are going to be. So I think we're doing things a bit out of order in that sense, but that's just my comment for the day. I just wanted to throw that out there. I'll stop with that. If you have any response to that, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I mean, I appreciate the perspective, and I appreciate the fact that it seems like that these pieces are not fitting together. I think for the most part, the pieces will have to fit together at some point, and sort of what the impacts are it will have to be explained, and that's sort of what I was trying to get at, to say that we will do more of that in the next workshop in our presentation there. So let me just say that, and so stay tuned, and you can look forward to sort of seeing how the pieces are fitting together, should be fitting together.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, Peter. Appreciate it.
Sure. Eric.
And look, thank you. And I apologize. My internet's been cutting in and out, so I may have just simply missed this. In the exceedance discussion on renewable resources, are you proposing to net this from the load curve, or are you proposing to give them an NQC value in each slice? And if it's in each slice, then if you're dealing with seasonality, is it the worst slice of the worst hour within that season?
Eric, that's a good question. For the most part, we haven't determined, and what you're really asking about is would this apply to a gross load basis in terms of having the wind and solar count on the supply side, or would this work to some degree on the demand side, or at least the requirement side, by saying, oh, we're going to be able to take the wind and solar off and do it on a net load basis. For the most part, our view is that you need to do whatever you decide to do, whether you do the requirements based on a gross load basis or on a net load basis, you need to be consistent about how you are accounting for and thinking about what the contribution is of the wind and the solar. And so it could apply to either.
Okay. Have you thought about if it's a supply side resource, given that you're having slices and you have to meet basically the worst need within that slice? What are you doing for the counting of that resource? So does a solar and wind resource have potentially 6 different values, and those differentiate by season as well?
Yes, they would have the values essentially that we're talking about are values for the season slice.
Okay.
So that
all right.
so that if we're talking about 6 4-hour slices, there would be essentially each resource would have 6 values or 6 values for each of those slices.
Okay, and it's the worst hour within that slice.
That would be, yes, that's the idea, or the thinking, the basic thinking of it. Exactly how that would work is again, we need to put the details together and have that.
Okay, thank you, Peter.
Sure. Nick.
Hey, thanks, Peter and Luke. Similar to Eric, having some internet issues, so hopefully I'll stay with you here. But I really appreciate the analysis here, and I think regardless of whether we're talking about a month-hour approach, seasonal 6-slice approach, or even the kind of net load structure that Daryush and Chris mentioned, I think this is a critical exercise to do in the determination of any of those. So I think this is really important. And I wanted to ask, I think your framing here of exceedance really is a proxy for thinking about how much generation we get from these resources on the worst day is really critical, and much more important than thinking about exceedance sort of on its own. I wanted to ask your thoughts on just using the worst day profiles, or maybe 3 worst days for each month, or something like that, rather than trying to translate this into a specific exceedance parameter. Have you given that any thought, or what's your perspective on that approach as opposed to a translation?
Nick, that's a good question. The thinking to some degree is that we want to try and be as accurate as possible and to take as much information in as possible. If you do go to sort of a worst day type of approach, you're basically saying that in most other days there are going to be plenty of resources, or plenty of those resources are going to be available, and so there from a resource counting perspective, you may be over procuring on that basis. So we're mindful of that, and we've thought about it, but we haven't. That certainly would be one option that could be used.
If I can offer one just very quick follow-up, I appreciate that perspective, Peter, and I think that's really important, is getting more information on more than just the worst day. I think one concern I have is, depending on the resources correlation of production and peak load, or sort of bad dayness, the exceedance might either really get it that well, or you might miss all the worst days if it's a negative correlation.
Yeah, Nick, I lost you there, but I think what you're saying is are we really capturing the correlation that we think we need with when the load is going to be higher load? And that's a good point. That's a good point, and that's something that I think needs to be thought about and part of the discussion in the exceedance determination.
Great. Well, I really appreciate you guys bringing this analysis forward. Thank you. I'm sorry, I should have announced I'm Nick Pappas on behalf of the Natural Resources Defense Council.
Thanks, Nick. Matt.
Okay, all right, Peter. No, we're gonna have to cut you off.
You're gonna cut it off? Okay, good, Scott.
Yeah.
I was wondering when you're gonna step in. So.
All right. So a couple of quick things before we turn it over to SEE for their presentation. Tom and Chris, can you please lower your hands? I've tried on my end, but you just keep popping back up for some reason. And then same thing for Eric. I have 4 people who didn't get to ask their questions. Let me just ask all of you real quickly if your questions were already asked by other participants. Matt Barmack, Kathleen Colbert, Doug Carpa. Actually, I guess just 3 left. Brian Beering. So the 4 of you, were your questions already asked?
Hey, Scott, can you hear me? This is Matt.
Yeah.
Yeah. To a certain extent, how would you like to handle this? Would it be helpful if I put my questions in the chat, or are you going to have another period for Q&A later?
I suppose either way, if you want to do it in the chat, you could do that. We also have Q&A at the end of the day.
Okay. Sounds good.
Why don't we have, maybe just to memorialize it, we'll have all 4 of you put your questions in the chat. And then if the response doesn't completely address your question, you feel like it was misunderstood, we can get back to it at the end of the day.
Thanks.
So I'll check with you when we're done with the final presentation. Okay, let's move to SE. And if I can ask all of the people I mentioned to lower your hands too. Matt, Brian.
Hi, good morning. This is just a technical check. Make sure everyone can hear me okay. Anyone?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay, great. Brent, are you good also on your side? There we go.
Yeah, so I got the presentation up, so everyone can see it. So I'll be running the presentation. Jeff can start off.
Hey, so good morning. Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for letting us present again. My name is Jeff Nelson, Director of FERC Rates Market Integration. And I also have with me, I'll let Brent introduce himself.
Sure. My name is Brett Buffington. I am the Manager of Integrated Resource Planning for SE.
And we're going to deep dive a bit. I really appreciate what PG&E did with some of the numerical analysis and some sort of frameworks. Ours is going to be more high level than that. So do appreciate very much what PG&E just did. So we thought we'd start by just sort of recapping how we're still viewing these questions and thinking them through. Recapping what I'll call the framework we're working in, which is sort of a 24-hour slices. There's a lot of flexibility within this framework. I think there's a lot of options. A lot of things will move together depending on how you decide one issue. It may influence how you decide another issue. Ultimately, with the goal of maintaining a certain reliability level, loss of load expectation at the end of the day. So a lot of things will move together, and one decision will likely influence another. But there is a lot of flexibility we see within our framework. So I thought we'd start with just sort of quickly reviewing how we're thinking these through. We are thinking it through in the 24-hour slice framework. We appreciate some of the feedback and comments and conversations we have had on this. It still is a work in progress. It's still a framework. Still like to figure out the best ways to make something like this work. And we still are very open up to ideas and suggestions on the best ways to do this. So the framework starts with we're going to have monthly showings, and each LSC is going to have to demonstrate that for the given month, they're able to meet their load plus a planning reserve margin for every day in quote unquote the worst day. And we've heard some discussions about, well, have you thought about averaging 3 worst days together? We haven't quite defined exactly what the worst day is, but it's a day that we view as troublesome, and we want to make sure that we can meet it in every hour under this approach. Again, you'll do basically a resource stacking exercise where you put the capacity for the resources in sort of a stack, and dispatchable resources that have use limitations, you can pick the hours where they're going to be dispatched in your stack. And as long as they are within their operating parameters, like a 100 megawatt battery, you used to say it's a 4-hour 100 megawatt battery, really has 400 megawatt hours you can spread wherever, but no single hour can be more than 100 megawatts because that's its limit. But you put it in whatever hours make sense based on your particular profile of resources and the load shape that you're having to meet to. And we've been a little high level on exactly how that load shape's developed. It's some flavor of load shape that is reasonably representative of the load that an LSC is serving. And whether that's super specific or we wind up with different categories of load shapes, or we wind up with some sort of formulaic approach based on what type of load is in your profile determines what that shape is. Once you have a load shape, you have to meet it plus its planning reserve in every hour. Also part of our proposal is that you need to bring enough excess capacity in hours where you are not using your batteries to be able to fully charge the usage of your batteries. So that's excess capacity in this graph is everything above that green line. I think Carrie mentioned, are we restricting it to only excess renewable production? No, we're not. Any way you can get energy into your battery will allow us to meet the reliability dimension of having the batteries charged and serving. We're not adding sort of an environmental constraint into this showing. We're viewing the environmental constraints as external through RPS requirements, GHG requirements. That'll drive the portfolios individuals do bring to the table. And we're just not throwing an extra constraint on in how you charge your batteries in this proposal. We also have to make sure that the hydro, this was touched on a little bit, has enough energy behind its capacity to do whatever it's claiming it's doing. And I'm sure we'll have additional discussions. PG&E talked on that, on what we assume on the energy of hydro. Ours is a monthly showing, so that lets us not have to deal with some of the impacts of season, such as hydro is a good example. Going into the summer, you might have a certain energy capability throughout the month, but going out of the summer, it may be very different. And we don't really have to sort of worry about averaging in a monthly showing approach. You have a monthly value of some sort of monthly showing, monthly understanding of what the units are good for. And also, as was sort of touched on, with the hourly basis, we don't have to, for any sort of individual resource, take sort of the worst hour within the slice because each slice is independent. So it sort of helps the problem where you've got one really bad hour, maybe for renewable production within a larger slice, really derating the effective value that resource is bringing to your RA showing. We don't really have that issue with hourly slices. We do have to still determine for all of our resources that are renewables, what profile and what value we are going to assume in each hour. I think all of these frameworks have to deal with that issue. We don't know with perfect foresight exactly what production is going to be. We have to forecast it, and that means there needs to be some methodology on what we're going to forecast and allow to count. And Brent's going to discuss some options and some considerations in those through some deeper slides. let's see if I hit everything here. Oh yeah, also, if you've got use limited resources, let's just say demand response programs that are only good for 4 hours, or they've got certain restrictions like a 6x16 energy contract, you've got to show it in the hours where it's actually usable. You can't show the 16-hour energy contract in any hours that are not within that 16 window. So we've got a couple little constraints based on what units are physically capable of doing. And as we noted last time, we have a single product. There's no unbundling. Once a resource has sold capacity, it is making itself available for its full capability. Shorthand is a 24-hour must offer, but that's not really true. It's really a full capability must offer. Even if it's only needed in one slice, a 1 hour of the day in our showing, even though we're still assuming that we're going to be using 4-hour minimum products. There's been a bunch of discussion, or there'll probably be more. But even if you're only needed for one block, you still have a must offer for the entire 24 hours if you're capable of doing it. Just like today in a lot of ways. We do allow under our proposal for units, say they're 100 megawatt units, to sell a portion of their capacity to one LSE, say 70 megawatts, and another portion of its capacity to a different LSE, say 30 megawatts. But just like today, you can't sell more than you're rated for, and you can't double count, double show. But a seller can sell to multiple people. But once it's made the first sale, let's just say that 70 megawatts, it has a full 70 megawatt must offer. If it then makes an incremental sale of 30 megawatts, it now has a full 100 megawatt must offer. If it only makes the 70 and doesn't make the 30, it only has a 70 megawatt must offer. So just like today. And we talked about this, the 4 consecutive hours. And here's another one that gets a little interesting that we're going to deep dive on, particularly with hybrid resources. Our general rule is for these resources to count as part of your showing. They have to be deliverable, just like today. Only deliverable resources count for RA. Say hybrid resources create some interesting new developments, and we not to steal thunder, but we need to talk more about exactly what's meant by deliverability, what can be showed for hybrid resources. And particularly if a hybrid resource is oversized, if it's larger than its interconnection, but it's going to be used for storing batteries, how that oversizing would work in a framework where you have to bring extra capacity to make sure you charge your battery. So there's some issues to talk through on hybrid resources. Also, whether or not the storage component of the hybrid is able to charge from the grid or is completely dependent on the facility, the renewable facility for charging. But we'll get more into that in a bit. Okay, so I think that's a quick sort of overview of our proposal. So as Brent's talking through, we have that framework in mind on what issues need to be sort of polished up and finalized within that sort of framework. That's how we are approaching this presentation.
Okay. So
Brent, anything else before I kind of like give you the mic?
No, I think we'll get into it. We have 3 relatively detailed slides as our next ones. Good. I guess if you have questions, raise your hands or put them in the chat. Maybe Jeff can identify them as we get to them. And I'm getting echo. Maybe Jeff.
Let me mute myself.
And so yeah, we have try to be as complete as possible with the resource types and as also as accurate as possible on the current approach to resource counting under the kind of single monthly showing. And then some potential approaches. Some of these we feel kind of stronger than others, but I wanted to put them out there because they've been part of our internal discussions and certainly part of discussions we've had in these workshops and kind of separately on the side with other parties. So I'll start at the top. So non-use limited dispatchable. So these are kind of the kind of perfect resources aside from kind of planned and forced outages. Today, they can count for up to Pmax, so up to their CAISO listed Pmax. Their 24-hour resources. We don't expect that to really need to change. I guess as PG covered earlier, that can be up to Pmax plus RAIM or UCAP with no RAIM. Think that either approach is fine. No matter how you slice the day up, these resources would just count across all those slices. We're looking hard at 24 slices, but they work even if you only had one slice. They fit cleanly in that. Use limited dispatchable. So the use limits can happen on a within the day or across a month. So you might have a peaker that can only run 200 hours in a month, or a peaker that can only run 11 hours in a day. Today, they get counted just like a 24-hour resource. So NQC up to Pmax, potentially a different MCC bucket, but typically, they still fit in one of those kind of higher MCC buckets. They get to count for full Pmax, maybe UCAP if RAIM goes away. Once again, kind of indifferent there. Although UCAP, getting rid of RAIM seems like something that'd be interesting. So should account for especially the daily, right? Given that the slice a day is looking at across the day, the daily use limits. How to account for monthly, annual, or other use limits? Those are kind of stickier questions, especially because slice a day is looking at a single day. There's information that could be used for this, use limit plans for one, but exactly how to manage that, I don't, we can have a discussion. Can the resource be counted in non-consecutive hours? So we think yes. A dispatchable resource, could be used in different slices, non-consecutive hours, non-consecutive slices. But maybe that's another discussion point. On this slide, we also have solar and wind. I want to make sure I'm hitting hard today. We have a single monthly effective load carrying capacity number. ELCC in general doesn't require to have a single monthly number, but that's what's made sense under the current resource adequacy regime. So, potentially you could have an hourly ELCC, as kind of note on the next slide over, but just in kind of as precise language as possible. Today we have a single monthly ELCC, and then a lot of apparatus to come up with that single number, to proxy for its actual contribution across all the hours in a month. As you implement slices, whether those be 1 hour slices or larger than 1 hour slices, some of that apparatus around ELCC likely goes away. Anyway, so solar, monthly profiles based on technology and or location. Maybe Marin County solar is different than Mojave Desert solar. To be determined by the CPUC. We had a pretty in-depth discussion about exceedance earlier. Forecast or kind of expected, expected value, whatever the case. There's some profile underneath there, and there's trade-offs to be made. We think that moving to hourly slices in particular gives solar and wind the best chance to provide to show how they contribute to reliability, and we definitely need hourly profiles under a 24 slice scenario. The resource specific performance should be just through like the total counting. So if a resource doesn't have an interconnection to match their AC capacity, that would be kind of within that's kind of the single value to be multiplied by the shape. Wind treated the same as solar. Today it's single monthly ELCC. Expect that to also have like a NQC like number that's closer to the actual installed capacity or deliverable installed capacity multiplied by a profile. We can get into I'm probably throughout today we'll have more discussions about how to come up with that profile. Expected value, exceedance. There's quite a bit earlier, and it seems like there's more comments to be had. Imports. Today's contracted megawatts. We look at the contracted amount and duration with a shape similar to a solar shape. The shape would need to match the actual contract type. So as maybe discussed earlier, 6x16 might not fit cleanly in a 4, 6, 8 hour slice. Depends on where those are shaped. An hourly slice would match match the shape of that import well. So that's the first slide. I'll move on to.
So Brent, why don't we slow for here? We've got a question from, looks like Paul Nelson, and just one thing I wanted to sort of throw in on the solar and wind. We do think that we should be sticking with sort of as large of buckets and sort of generic profiling as possible. We don't think it's appropriate to sort of create a custom profile for every single project. Start getting into variance and covariance of based on what specific units you have in your profile. We don't think that's the way to go. We're not clear how many buckets are appropriate, but we do think we should be putting as many resources together and coming up with sort of a profile for all those resources, as large of a bucket as is practical and reasonable.
Yeah, it looks like
Okay,
there's a couple, yeah.
Yeah, why don't I go into questions? The first hand I see up is Paul Nelson. Do you have a question?
Yes, I do. This is Paul Nelson on behalf of CLECA. Just do a quick sound check.
Sound great.
I hear you.
Okay. So the issues of the reformed hourly ELCC, I'm really struggling on this because traditionally ELCC has been an annual construct, and it's derived from the distribution of a loss of load expectation across time and months. And my understanding is how the Energy Division creates monthly ELCCs in months where there's no loss of load expectation is you arbitrarily remove a resource that's actually in the resource stack. You have to generate loss of load expectation in a particular month. If you're going to take that to an hourly level, now you're going to have to, let's say you're trying to get a noon time where you have all this solar in the spring. Well, you're just going to have to pull out a whole bunch of resources for your noon slice. So I don't know what ELCC and the loss of load, the underlying loss of load expectation means anymore when you try to do it in this manner. I really struggle with the theoretical that construct behind this.
So
you
Paul,
given more thought on that?
Yeah, so I agree. ELCC, at least the current concept and method of ELCC doesn't make any sense in the slice world. ELCC seems to was put into kind of proxy for some of the things that are now being directly addressed under the slice, whatever version of slice we end up with. And so reformed ELCC would necessarily need to be a completely different method. And it could be, unless you change the statute, it needs to be called ELCC, and it could be exceedance based or some other LOLE based, choose an exceedance, something like that. But Energy Division, I think, would have to call it ELCC unless the statute changes.
Okay, so I think that's helpful in trying to understand why it's being labeled ELCC if it's to meet legislation requirements.
Yeah, I mean,
it's certainly not as what's been done in a lot of the theoretical writings of what ELCC is in the past. And I guess, one of the things on the agenda that's going to have to is what's the likelihood could you get legislation changed?
Yeah, and that's been kind of our one of our thoughts is, given that this needs to go live 2024, is it worth or needed to get legislation changed? It seems like Energy Division can just change the methodology. I mean, the heart of it is making sure that wind and solar are counted appropriately against the rest of the resources in the portfolio. And I have the legislation up somewhere else on my computer, but
guys,
anyway,
I think
there's no method.
So I'm going to move on to the next question. Thank you all. The next hand I see is Doug Carpa.
Yeah, hey, and I completely agree with Brent on that ELCC question. The statute's really not very clear, except it needs to be some methodology for assessing how well solar and wind can meet load. And any of those should work. Actually, totally different. This is actually the same question that I was going to have for PG&E. Apologies if I missed your explanation of it, because I was also having internet connection issues. But on this question of using PMAX versus UCAP, I actually was kind of curious, why would we not use UCAP, since that is already designed to account for the various outages that we see, particularly the ones that are correlated with high loads because of high temperatures. And the second piece, and so I think that gets closer to what is kind of analogous to an exceedance methodology for these resources. Like, what's the probability that this resource is actually going to be available, and having a frequency weighted estimate of that. That's somewhat analogous to an exceedance. And the other question, actually, looking back through the UCAP methodology, and looking also at the PG&E aspect of it, is this question of, do we use 3 years? I noticed that solar and wind would use 5 years. And I really would recommend we use longer periods of time, because I think, as we learned, like in the August 2020 case, a lot of what's going to be causing serious problems are these rarer, more extreme events. And we might end up with a situation where, if we just don't happen to have a big heat wave in the last 3 years, then UCAP will artificially overestimate how likely these resources are going to be available when the rubber really meets the load. And so I worry a little bit that there's going to be a historical sampling problem. So I don't, just kind of curious what the thinking is, why UCAP is not squarely like, this is what we use. Because we know PMAX is just not going to capture the volatility of those resources.
So I'm going to jump in here for sort of a non-technical, but sort of a policy view. Edison's been very supportive of UCAP, and we're pursuing it. I think more of the point on these slides is that either way is, if you will, compatible with 24 slices. It'll, like we talked about, depending on how you pick some of these inputs, it's going to change how you treat some of the other considerations, like what is your planning reserve margin at the end of the day? What sort of reliability are you actually getting from what you've put in here, depending on some of these assumptions like PMAX or UCAP. So Brent, we just, if you had a, this is an unlimited discussion, I think, on the correct sample and the time frame. So I do want to make sure our presentation gets all the way through. But Brent, if you had a quick thoughts on some of those other issues, and then we'll move to the next question. And then I'm going to stop after Eric Little's hand so we can get on to the next slide. We've got Now Tung, and then I'll go to Eric Little. So any other final thoughts, Brent, on that line? Because there's a lot in there.
Yeah. I don't have any final thoughts. Maybe we can move on for that one.
Okay. No, plenty to talk about in there, though. Okay, I've got next hand I see is Now Tung. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Hey, Jeff. This is Noah Tung from Middle River Power.
Oh, it's Noah.
Okay. Yeah. Hey, so I understand the profileness of solar and wind resources as would be sort of calculated, under this proposal. What I haven't figured out is transactions, in the sense of, there are some hours that are just during the sunlight hours, let's say, right? There are NQC values that are greater than the NQC values that are lower. If I'm trying to buy a 25 megawatt capacity value from a solar resource, then does that mean that the rest of the amount that's above the 25 megawatts, sometimes maybe it's just not there, then is somebody going to be left with less slices with less megawatts? Can you help me walk through that a little bit?
So how I see it is you're buying a profile shape multiplied by whatever the capacity of the unit is. So a 25 megawatt. Once we define what the profile shapes look like, a 25. The shape is normalized by the megawatts that you've bought.
I see. So you're always buying a pro rata share, essentially.
Yeah.
Well, you're buying a profile. You're buying an hourly profile that's normalized by the amount of capacity you've bought, or multiplied by a normalized profile multiplied by your capacity. That's how I see it, Brent.
Yeah. So said another way, you're buying that profile, the 25 megawatt profile of a solar plant. If you're looking to solve a need in the middle of your day, that's going to solve many needs, right? So it's going to solve up to 25 megawatts through the middle of the day. It might solve some on the tails, right? The mornings, but it'll be 8 megawatts at hour and 7 potentially of that, of that 25 megawatts would actually count towards the showing.
Okay, appreciate that. Thanks.
Okay, it looks like I lost Eric. Eric, if you did have something, I'll give you a chance to chime in. Otherwise, Brent, let's move on to slide 6.
Yeah, I actually realized that you answered my question on slide 6, so I put my hand down.
Okay, well, you can come first if you still have a question, okay?
Okay, so slide 6 is covering storage, hybrids, and co-located. So today, storage, as kind of noted in an earlier presentation, so thanks PG&E for teeing up quite a few of these issues. Maximum output over a 4-hour period. Potential approaches, considerations. We say consider limiting to 1 cycle for showing purposes, because it starts to complicate showings. In whatever slice world we end up with, starts to really complicate showings. If you show 1 full cycle in a 4-hour block, you then have to have rules around how much downtime you need for the resource. So under typical efficiencies, assuming you could actually get a full 4-hour block, then you need like 5 hours of downtime before it can go again. It's not a deal breaker, but it does create an administrative burden that's pretty unique to storage. How to account for partial usage. You have kind of have to assume at the start of the day what charge level it's at, or in any so do you assume that you have at hour 1 a battery that's ready to go. And I know we start to get into a little bit more of like operational things, but this is really from a planning standpoint, kind of what can you plan, what can you account for. I anticipate maybe some discussion around this, but I'll maybe I'll move on to hybrids and co-located.
Yeah, just one add-on thought, as we said earlier. Just because it's 1 cycle doesn't mean you have to be a continuous 4-hour discharge. I mean, you could be, half output for 8 hours, a non-continuous hourly slices in our model, but it would still just be 1 cycle.
And one item that keeps coming up in our discussions is like the incentives within the RA program. So in so much as we want to incentivize larger batteries, kind of more dispatchability, the rules should generally be pointing in that direction, giving allowing larger, more flexible resources to count for. So maybe move on to hybrids. So the current approach is I'm going to read this off exactly. So sum of renewable resource energy to charge storage during the available charging hours, and the remaining renewable capacity multiplied by an ELCC factor. So some important considerations are that hybrids can be oversized. So we might well see a 200 megawatt hour solar resource, AC solar resource, underneath a 100, 150 megawatt interconnection with a battery. And so allowing different configurations of the underlying renewable resource, so wind, solar, whatever other renewable could be out there, the storage, megawatt and megawatt hour, and the interconnection size, all play into kind of how much capacity you would expect a hybrid resource to provide in any slice. And some we expect some hybrids to only be configured to charge off the underlying renewable, and then have to deal with that appropriately. Some of them may be able to charge off the renewable or off the grid. Once again, depend on their actual physical configuration. So all that said, the final bullet is, so we think it's a good idea for there to be default shapes for renewables based on their underlying configuration. This kind of gets down to maybe Noah's question or others is how does someone know what they're buying, right? And so for any given configuration, it would be certainly helpful to know that this resource with that combination of interconnection, underlying renewable, the renewable technology, megawatt and megawatt hour of the battery, has some kind of default shape, and potentially it could be shown in different ways if the LLC showing the resource needs it to. But if all those are kind of degrees of freedom and not really well understood during the transaction kind of period, the upfront transaction, seems to be difficult. So kind of having some kind of default shape that takes into account those variables, think would be helpful and maybe even necessary. Co-located.
If I could add one more thing on this, because it's not complicated enough. There's still this question of sort of deliverability, and if you've got let's just say solar panels paired with a battery, which one of your resources has deliverability associated with it? And I think we have a certain set of rules and a certain set of incentives to make people describe the deliverability of their project in a certain way. We really need to look very closely at that with hybrids and how they're evolving. Like even in our framework, the extra energy you bring has to be from a deliverable resource that's shown in your showing. It's got to be part of your stack. But what if you plan on charging your battery with excess, I think Brent gave an example, you've got 200 megawatt AC capability, 150 megawatt interconnection. What if you plan on using that extra 50 megawatts to charge your battery? How do we recognize that, hey, that's a legitimate, and maybe we've got to do some adjustments to that, but that's a legitimate way to charge your battery. We're not going to make you bring an extra amount of capacity in your showing, knowing that's how your configuration works. So there's issues to really work out here on the deliverability, what exceptions to the rules are there in the showing, and how are we going to let people represent their deliverability of their hybrid resources in this framework?
Yeah.
Sorry, Brent.
Yeah, it's kind of lean into the deliverability thing. So I'm not a deliverability expert, but for sure, whatever slice world we end up with, whether that be 1 hour slices, 4 hour slices, 24-hour slices, whatever else it is, deliverability in slice one, whatever slice one ends up, it matters. And so we expect that the resource counting needs to be underneath the deliverability. And so, maybe that's already handled. Once again, I'm not an expert on deliverability, but there's, maybe a discussion to be had on the method that is used to develop those numbers. And for co-located, so separate from hybrid, those are two different resource IDs bidding to CAISO separately. Maybe they're contractually linked. One sells RECs to the other. We think those resources should be separate resources subject to whatever capacity constraints they have. If for some reason they share an interconnection, then they share deliverability, that have to be taken into account in the showing amounts. Is it a good place to stop?
Good place to stop. I see 3 hands up. We'll try to, could someone time check us? Do we have till noon? Is that our slotted time?
Yeah, that's what I have written down.
That's right.
Time is
Okay.
fine.
So we'll keep going. So I've got 3 hands. We'll try to hit these. Kathleen Colbert. Kathleen, are you there? You're at the top of my hand stack. Okay,
can
Kathleen,
you hear me?
Now we can
Yes.
hear you. Great.
Okay, 1 second. I had to switch over to the computer.
And then if you could just tell us who you're representing, I'm sorry if I should remind everyone.
Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Can you hear me?
Yes, Vistra.
Okay, great. Thanks for this presentation. I just wanted to add a couple thoughts for you as you just crowdsource for everyone. Vistra is a storage developer and operator. And so a couple pieces of feedback on the standalone storage. One thing that like looking at some of your items that you brought up is that I did want to emphasize, and one thing that, I'm struggling with and that would be helpful to unpack more in working with the CAISO perhaps, is that this idea of limiting to 1 cycle is not an operational reality. For those of you who are more familiar with how non-generator resources or batteries are modeled, they're not modeled as having commitments. They're modeled as being online continuously and being able to be cycled, even partial cycles, being able to be discharged and charged at any point in time based on economics. I hope you're also aware that the CAISO is going to begin doing, there's going to be bid insertion rules applied to storage, that it's RA resources. And so the feasibility of making an assumption of a 1 cycle is not consistent with how CAISO wants to use and trying to use the battery storage fleet. It also would result in a much more inflexible storage fleet that would greatly reduce the value of storage, just from an operations perspective, let alone for helping to integrate renewables. If that kind of assumption is made, it will have impacts, right? It's going to have impacts on, it says to me, I don't need you more than 4 hours, even though you're really available for like 11 to 12 hours a day. And that's something that from a commercial space, I just really want to caution everyone from, let's be mindful that if we set up rules, you're going to see in operations that ripple effect, and we don't want to see that kind of limitation. I mean, I don't.
So I appreciate the comments. So first, just to be clear, that we're not restricting operations in the real world day to day to align with what's done in the monthly showing. I just want to be clear on that. You can operate basically any way you want in real time, and that might wind up in multiple cycles happening, not just a single cycle. So we're not trying to restrict your operating flexibility at all. I do appreciate the second point you're making, or at least I heard it in there, is that, yeah, but it may impact the commercial value of the resources if the RA showing is limited to a single cycle. So I think there are 2 issues, but just for, and I hear that. I'm not exactly sure how to address that issue, but I hear it. But certainly we're not restricting real operations.
Well, no, that's a really helpful clarification, Jeff. I think that is helpful. I think a principle is that we should have alignment between what we expect resources to do in operations against how they're being contracted and shown. I think, to me, that's a key principle. That is a good design principle. Just to throw it out there, I think we might be overcomplicating the storage to some extent. Whenever we do any kind of solicitation, between a buyer and a seller, it's totally feasible to make it transparent what the round trip efficiency of that resource is, and then for the seller to provide information as to how many hours of full output that would mean based on their capability, their round trip efficiency, how they're building it. That's a project detail. That's something that can be part of an offer. And so once you have that, you would have the equivalent of this idea of a profile that you're describing. So let's say that storage, we say a storage asset has 11 hours of full output. You know, it's 11 hours. So 11 of the hours across the day should have a full output profile. And then honestly, I think you should put those in, if you were to do an approach with some kind of forecast on the highest need hours, with the restriction of not more consecutive hours than the full output can do. So that would take a little bit of sophistication, but it's not infeasible.
So Kathleen, I'm going to stop this one here just with a quick, I appreciate that, just to say, yeah, that's exactly what we're proposing. However many hours, if you're 4, 5, 6, 7, 10, whatever those hours are, you can show in those hours as long as it's feasible, and whatever hours you think are appropriate to show in. So I think we're actually in agreement there.
Okay.
Okay, just for sake of time, I'm going to jump on to the next person. It's Chris Devon. Thank you, Kathleen. Chris.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, can you hear me?
Sure can. Thank you.
Yeah, it's Chris Devon, Customized Energy Solutions. I'll make a couple of quick points here. One, I definitely agree with your approach here in needing to consider the sizing of the hybrid resources and what could be oversized. I think that's important. It doesn't necessarily have to be deliverable above its interconnection amount to be able to still charge those storage devices. So I think it is important that we consider that. I think the current approach that the CPUC has adopted is overly conservative, in particular with the idea of the grid charging restriction is the ITC, and then the idea of these oversizing of the potential resource components to be able to support that. So I think that's really important. And I support that part of this proposal for sure. I think we need to look at that a little bit closer and think how we're going to do that. On the deliverability point, though, I just wanted to make the point that I don't think you necessarily need to worry about doing more deliverability studies over different slices of the day or something like that. Really, the CAISO has their 2 on-peak and off-peak deliverability studies. I think it'll be captured there, and I don't think it's really going to be necessary to try to look at, is it going to be deliverable at different slices of the day? If it's deliverable on peak, then it should be fine in the other hours. So perhaps CAISO's deliverability experts could confirm that at some point in the future. Maybe we have offline discussion on that, but that's my understanding how that would work. Thanks.
Hey, Chris, thank you. Yeah, I think we're in agreement with you. We did just want to flag that, but I think we agree with that we don't really need to do anything, but we did want to flag it. So thank you for those comments. Matt Barmack is the next hand. Hey, Matt.
Hey, Jeff. How's it going? How are you?
Wonderful. You sound great. Thank you. And you're with Calpine.
Likewise, I'm with Calpine. Hey, Jeff. I apologize. You may have covered this when you rolled out your proposal originally, but I think in your first deck, you asserted that your proposal is largely consistent with the current CAISO backstop process. And so just wanted to revisit this topic because we haven't heard about it, today or I think in the last workshop. But how do you view the CAISO piece of this working? Is it sort of qualitatively similar to what Bridget kind of started to sketch out with respect to the PG&E proposal, that the CAISO might validate a particular hour, or how would they be looking at the solar, for example, under this proposal?
Ooh, on the back. So the first thing I think about backstopping is someone has failed to meet their requirements, right? So in our showings, it's a pass-fail. It's 24 hours, but it's a single pass-fail showing. You either passed it or you failed it.
Right. Okay. But just so if I could just interject briefly, but I'm assuming that would be a PUC determination, but it's the CAISO that has the backstop authority, and like I'm not sure they want to look at use your spreadsheet and determine a pass fail. Maybe they do. I'm just raising the question.
Yeah, so it may be a better question from the ISO how they'll they'll define what failure is. But if they stuck with their current process, they would make sure that that everything was turned in and that all the requirements that they put on, I believe, the local regulatory authorities in collective were met. So if they fell short from whatever metric they're using, if they're still using a single hour metric, we're still turning over all the resources. And if they just want to look at, a single hour to do their test, they can look at a single hour, all the resources will be there. And if there's not enough resources, they'll deem someone has not complied. And then the local regulatory authority will pass on the backstops based on, in my opinion, who failed. They would get first cut.
Yeah.
That's how it should.
Okay.
Now,
yeah.
I don't know if the ISO is going to look at multiple hours going forward. I mean, let's just say the failure is in hour 7. Like, we've never seen that before, but now people are short in hour 7. The ISO is really concerned. They at least have the information. I think we could provide the information so they could determine hour 7 was a problem. And then when they went out and bought capacity, they'd make sure, well, I'm not going to get any whatever. I should have picked hour 5 where there was no sun out. I'm not going to go get some extra capacity from a solar unit because it's not going to help me. I think the ISO is going to have to mature on how it determines a fail.
Hey, Jeff, just a time check. We have 3 minutes and 2 more slides.
2 minutes.
Okay, 2 minutes.
Thanks,
2 minutes and 2 more slides.
Thanks, Jeff.
So maybe we can get to the final slide. I just want to get through the slides and then
we'll get to the slide and we'll jump to Sergio. There's one hand left. We'll come back to Sergio.
So this one probably less controversial than some of the other ones, or less discussion to be had. So we just want to be complete. Although maybe our response or demand response part is kind of light. Non-dispatchable cogen biomass. That could be UCAP as well, or retain the current approach, just across, it's a flat shape. Dispatchable hydroelectric, current approach, or kind of pure UCAP, once again, it's dispatchable, so it gets a flat shape. Non-dispatchable hydroelectric and geothermal, that's it's a backward look today, could retain that, or UCAP with a flat shape. Closed loop pump hydro storage or pump storage hydro does not exist in CAISO, and it actually isn't really well considered in the current RA guide. We'd expect it to be similar to dispatchable hydroelectric. Anyway, the potential approach, treat it like a standalone battery. It'd have the same kind of characteristics if and when closed loop exists. And then demand response, once again, kind of light, just, but shown only within the available hours or slices. And then with a minute left, so how to account for monthly use limits? There's some in the chat that maybe UCAP handles that well enough. There could be a daily capacity check to make sure that everything that you brought in the use limit plans plus the non-use limited resources, meet your total capacity demand across a month. Maybe there's some light use of MCC buckets just to handle monthly use limits. SE would prefer those go away, but maybe that there's some case for them to be used in the future world. We talked about this earlier, use limited thermal, do they need to be shown in consecutive slices? We don't think so. Should there be any restrictions? Another one to tee up is if exceedances be used, what level is appropriate? Had a lot of discussion already, maybe we'll have more discussion later today. Can LOLE help make that choice, right? I think Paul Nelson's comment was around that. To retain the current ELCC approach, you use the LOLE. How does that actually work? I don't think I'm sure. Maybe SE isn't sure as a whole. And is appropriate to have different exceedances for different technologies, and so potentially. So that's all of our prepared content, and we're actually a minute over.
So
yeah, this is Scott. Let me jump in for a second.
One hand.
Yeah, so Jeff and Brent, my understanding was that you will not be available this afternoon. Is that correct?
Late afternoon. I'm not available after 3. Jeff, not after 2 or something like that.
Okay, so we had at the at the start of the workshop, mentioned the possibility that we might push back into lunch a little bit so that we could be sure that questions regarding your presentation could be answered. So why don't we go ahead and allocate another 15 minutes or so here to do that? And then we'll just shift the schedule back.
Okay, in that case, Sergio, you're at the top of the list. Sergio Duanas.
Yeah, hi, thank you. This is Sergio Dueñas with the California Energy Storage Alliance. Could you go back a couple of slides to your slide on storage? Yeah, that one, exactly. So I have a question here. Something that we think has a lot of value of looking at an hourly approach is that it really does limit the potential of undercounting or overcounting resources, so that we can, make sure that this is the LSCs can meet their requirements. Their requirements actually reflect the reality of the grid, and also they can meet it in a cost-effective fashion. So we like that element of Edison's proposal. But something that is interesting to me here is on your storage bullet points on the third row column, it says, let's consider the downtime needed for another full charge. And this is something interesting to me because it suggests that if you get a 4-hour resource, the only way to get incremental value from one cycle is to engage in another full cycle and get the energy needed also to charge fully this resource. Whereas in the examples that we've seen in the prior SE presentation, one of the benefits was actually showing you can only dispatch or need storage when you actually need it, not needed to actually show like a double full cycle. Is this something that you guys have considered on? Is this what you are trying to communicate with quote unquote partial usage? These are mainly questions for clarification. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll take a first shot, and then maybe Brent, who actually does the optimization, can chime in. So just for clarity, we'll allow you to show partial use. Our current proposal is it's one cycle, but you can model the discharge of that any hour you want, any amount you want, up to the physical capabilities and the storage capabilities. So you don't have to show the whole battery's output in every hour. You can show half in 2 hours. What we're trying to do is, it's sort of and I forget who else raised the point, Kathleen. Batteries in reality are sort of constantly charging a little bit, discharging a little bit. They have the potential to charge a little more, and then discharge a whole bunch, and then have to charge. So they're very dynamic. They're not just sort of fire once and forget. We don't really know how to model that in something like a forward RA showing. So it's a simplified assumption to say, look, on these really bad days, you're going to produce in the hours that are really tough to meet as a simplifying assumption for an RA showing. And that allows us to keep the showings doable through a stacking exercise rather than having to use some sort of optimization to verify your showing. And Brent, if you're talking, you're on mute.
Yeah, so maybe to bet off that, yeah, for sure, we know batteries are constantly providing grid services, all hours of the day, right? But this is specifically a capacity showing. So, assuming that if you're going to show from a RA capacity standpoint, you're going to use that entire block of energy. And then what you do for the other hours, I think that there needs to be a larger discussion about storage in particular. We started today and maybe even started last week of, is this one cycle approach appropriate, and are there simplified ways to take into account the, for a battery, the interconnection, the megawatt hour, in a way that's straightforward and meets an LSC's needs. So just like for the hybrid, maybe it's like a default shape, and I think that was mentioned earlier. There could be ways to make this kind of a tractable problem, but at least the way we've constructed some of our internal tools and thought process, once you get beyond one cycle like that, the allocation algorithm becomes pretty complicated, and the validation thereof is even more complicated. So I'm not saying it's not possible and maybe not even preferable. It seems like it's a little bit difficult to do.
I'm trying to better understand too what is this algorithm problem, because it seems to be like from PG&E's original proposal too. Well, if you have a 4-hour resource, you can show it in different slices non-consecutively. We know that is a simplification of reality, but that's an accounting purpose. Why would you want additional verification on actual operations on top of this accounting mechanism when we are aware that this doesn't limit the actual operational ability of storage, right? It's still going to bid 24/7. So I guess what I'm saying is, in PG&E's 4-hour slice proposal, you can show non-consecutively more than one cycle. We already know that is a simplification. It would be a shame to lose that just by having more granularity and requirements in an hourly fashion, when we can retain the simplification, just not allowing it to happen consecutively. Yeah.
So potentially, and as we get deeper, as we maybe collectively explore 24 slices, figuring that out, I think would be a kind of key milestone.
Yeah. So Sergio, so thank you. I appreciate the comment, and yeah, I think it is something for us to think about. Is there a simple, just algebraic way to represent multiple cycles? Something for us to think about. If there's a simple algebraic way, yeah, it's really, if we can find that, I don't think in theory we object. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next hand. Rick O'Connell, if you could tell us who you're with, Rick, and you have the floor.
Great, thank you. This is Rick O'Connell with Grid Lab. I'm also representing CERT. I just wanted to echo Chris Devon's comment. I appreciate your thinking of the hybrids here, and I think this approach is really nice in the sense that you're looking forward and understanding that hybrids are going to have potentially be oversized for their interconnection limit, potentially be oversized for their AC limit. So I appreciate that. And then I also just wanted to mention that we hope to be, there's been a lot of talk about LOLE, kind of ELCC and exceedance. We hope to be presenting at the next workshop some analysis where we're actually going to do real LOLE analysis and compare to exceedance. So hopefully that'll help inform the discussion around exceedance that we've been all having today. Thank you.
Great. No, I look forward to that.
So there's
okay. I don't see any other hands. Do you see questions?
Yeah, looks like there's been quite a few. But maybe it's just discussion. Any questions for us?
Yeah, I would propose that we do what I'd suggested for PG&E earlier. If there are questions in the chat, if you can stay online in the Teams meeting long enough to just respond to those within the chat function, please go ahead and do that. And then I would suggest that we break now for lunch and come back at 12:45, so we've got an extra 5 minutes for lunch. That'll just make the rest of the scheduling throughout the day a little easier to keep track of. Any final comments from you, Brendan or Jeff?
I just thank you for the opportunity to present. Good question.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks. It was great. Thank you. All right. So bye, everyone, and we will come back at 12:45. And I would just suggest that everyone go on mute until you come back from lunch. Thanks.